everyone, to the John F. Kennedy School of Government Forum for this event on U.S. policy in Cambodia. I have the opportunity to introduce the panel this evening. We are very honored to have David Lambertson, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Asia and Pacific, here representing the Bush administration's view. We have David Hawk, who many of you may be aware is one of the private citizens in the United States that's taking a role in investigating the crimes of genocide during the Pol Pot period in Cambodia. We have two very distinguished members of the United States Congress. Congressman Stephen Solars from New York, who chairs the subcommittee on Asia and Pacific for the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States House of Representatives, who has been one of the leading figures in the United States from the congressional point of view of shaping our government's policy not only in Southeast Asia but throughout Asia. And we're very happy that he's here this evening to join us in this very current discussion. It's also a great honor for those of us in Massachusetts to welcome back again Congressman Chester Atkins, who represents Massachusetts' 5th congressional district. Congressman Atkins has been a leader on the subject that we're going to be discussing this evening, I think primarily driven by the number of constituents that he represents in the Congress, who have made their way to the United States as refugees, and many of them settled in his district. He, like Congressman Solars, has become an expert on this subject of policy, and we are very happy to have him here again. We've had him here on many other occasions. He wears several hats, as you know. He's the chairman of our State Democratic Committee as well. To lead the discussion this evening, again, we are honored by the presence of Mr. Nayan Chanda, who has been at the school before and hopefully will be at the school again. Nayan has been described as the E.F. Hutton of Indochina. When Nayan speaks, most people listen. We're honored to have him here with us this evening to give us first an overview of the situation in Cambodia, the roles that U.S. policy might play there, and at this time I would like to turn the podium over to Nayan to lead this discussion for us this evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, friends. It's a great honor for me to be here presenting before this audience. I have this impossible task of trying to tell you about what happened in Cambodia in the last 11 years in 5 minutes. That gives me less than 30 seconds per year. I'll just say a few words. First of all, Cambodia, you may recall, is a country the size of New Mexico. But this country had the misfortune of receiving more tons of bomb in 1 year than Japan received during the entire Second World War. Then there was a war for 5 years between 70 and 75, during which an estimated 60,000 people were killed. 600,000 people were killed. And then the 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days of the Khmer Rouge, in which approximately a sixth of the population was wiped out. And the reason we are here tonight to discuss the policy is because people are still dying in Cambodia. And if the Khmer Rouge succeed in sneaking their way to political power, because the West considers them to be a legitimate political party, democratic party, then we are going to see yet another phase of bloodletting. This conflict has gone on for so long that one may be forgiven if one forgets how it all started. If one listens to the US government's interpretation of the war, we have been repeatedly told the root cause of the Cambodia problem is the Vietnamese invasion and occupation of Cambodia. Well, on September 26th, the Vietnamese army announced their total withdrawal from Cambodia. And October 6th, at a White House briefing, Defense Intelligence Agency officer for Southeast Asia said, I quote, "From a strategic standpoint, we can safely say that the Vietnamese army has, in fact, withdrawn from Cambodia. By this, I mean that even if some individual troops remain, Vietnam no longer has organized military units in Cambodia capable of carrying out combat operations." In other words, the root cause of the Cambodia problem has been resolved. Vietnamese have gone home. So why then we still have the conflict? Well, the answer to that question lies in the fact that for the sake of political convenience, Washington has chosen to ignore other causes of the problem that lay in Cambodia. The fact of Washington and the Western nations in general and ASEAN countries focusing on the Vietnamese presence as the main problem has led them to do a deal with the devil, the Khmer Rouge. And the result is what we see now. The Cambodia conflict did not begin, as many of us would like to believe, in December 1978 when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia. It began in February 1967 when the Khmer Rouge launched their first guerrilla operation against Prince Sihanouk's government in Battambang province. That was the beginning of a revolutionary warfare, an attempt to remodel the society in their image, and that war is still continuing. The Vietnamese invasion was an additional element to that continuing struggle by a group of Khmers to refashion the society on a radical model. The fact is that between 1975 and 1978, the Khmer Rouge carried a war against Cambodia's people. And that war would have been carried to its finish had not the Khmer Rouge fallen out among themselves, and provoked Vietnam into invading Cambodia. Today we would not be discussing Cambodia. Today we will be discussing the demise of Cambodia, because Cambodia would have been finished if the Khmer Rouge were allowed to carry on the revolution the way they began in 1975. The Vietnamese have had a long-term strategic concern about their position in Indochina, in Cambodia and Laos. The Vietnamese certainly wanted to have a system by which they could dominate Cambodia and Laos and control the political system there. But it was an ambition, an objective, which the Khmer Rouge, certainly by their policies, telescoped and made it happen much quicker than the Vietnamese would have done on their own. So the fact is that the Vietnamese were provoked. For 1.5 years. The Khmer Rouge constantly attacked Vietnamese borders, killed hundreds of civilians, leading the Vietnamese to invade Cambodia and install a regime of its choosing from the survivors of the Khmer Rouge purges. And since 1979, when the Khmer Rouge were overthrown and Hunsan Regime was installed, we have seen a new phase of that conflict in which the Western world has turned a blind eye to the revival, rebuilding of the Khmer Rouge for the realpolitik reason of using the Khmer Rouge as the main stick to beat the Vietnamese. And in order to facilitate that job, China and the Western world has supported the formation of a coalition government of Democratic Cambodia, an entirely fictitious organization which doesn't have a postal address, yet that organization is given the seat at the United Nations. And now, with the withdrawal of the Vietnamese, we are seeing a conflict which is, again, the original conflict of the Khmer Rouge trying to recapture power, to implement their policies. And unfortunately, in that Khmer Rouge strategy, the two regimes, previous regimes which have been overthrown, Prince Sihanouk's and Lon Nol's, have joined hand to oppose the incumbent regime of Hunsan Regime. Now, the question is, the Vietnamese have gone home, and the Cambodian problem has not been resolved. So the antibody that the Western world has helped nourish, the Khmer Rouge, is now threatening to kill the very patient it was cultured to prevent, to protect. So this evening we are privileged to have three very important people from Washington, and I would like to hear their diagnosis of the Cambodian problem and their prescriptions. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you, Nyan. It's an honor for me to be here. It's perhaps a precarious honor, knowing the lineup that I have at the table with me. But it is indeed an honor to be seated between Congressman Solars and Atkins instead of in front and below them, as I customarily am. The policy of the United States government with respect to Cambodia is to attempt still to achieve what we call a comprehensive settlement of the conflict, one which verifies the Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia, puts in place strong measures to prevent the Khmer Rouge from returning to power, and provides an opportunity for self-determination for the Cambodian people. Self-determination is something that could be achieved through a process of elections organized by a transitional regime, and it is this general approach to the question of how one gets from where we are now to where we would like to be in Cambodia, which has been the purpose and the objective of most of the negotiating activity, diplomatic activity that has taken place over the past year. That activity was tended to pick up last spring and summer, inasmuch as the Vietnamese withdrawal clearly was hastening and the deadline was being foreshortened, and that gave renewed urgency to the need to get some kind of a settlement in place to prevent the outbreak of chaos following a withdrawal. And so there were contacts among the Cambodian parties, and the French and Indonesian initiative to organize an international conference in Paris. The purpose of the conference was to achieve a comprehensive, not a so-called partial settlement. In other words, a settlement that addressed and attempted to resolve not only the so-called external issues, withdrawal of Vietnamese forces, the imposition of an international peacekeeping force, cutting off of arms supplies to all of the factions, but also the crux of the issue, the internal question, the question of what kind of transitional arrangement could be put together, sometimes called the question of power sharing. The conference met, it worked hard. We certainly worked hard to try to achieve what we went there for, an agreement, a negotiated agreement ending the fighting in Cambodia. There was a good deal of progress made, I would contend, with respect to those so-called external questions. In particular, a lot of work was done with respect to an international peacekeeping mechanism, which will be very useful the next time a conference convenes, when I hope everything can come together. There was work done in elaborating international guarantees. There was very good progress on the question of how and under what conditions the displaced persons along the Thai border would be repatriated to their homes, and a broad outline of a plan for the reconstruction of Cambodia through an international program was also generally agreed. But all of those were the essentially peripheral, important but peripheral issues that the Paris conference was grappling with, and the key question of power sharing, remained unresolved. In our view, the main reason that it was not resolved was because of rigidity on the part of the Phnom Penh regime and Hanoi and the Soviets on the question of power sharing. It wasn't simply that the PRK was unwilling to share power with the Khmer Rouge, it was that they were unwilling to share power with anyone, including the non-communist resistance. In fact, as the conference drew to a close a couple of days before its end, Hun Sen announced, said outright in his summing up his final statement, that in the PRK's view, there could be and should be no power sharing until an election was held. The viewpoint of the majority and our continuing view is that there needs to be some degree of sharing of power before that election is held. And I know there are precedents for doing it other ways in other countries. But I think the essential requirement for progress toward a political settlement in Cambodia is going to be a solution which in some way reduces the advantage that the PRK would have in an election. The Paris conference did not succeed then. There was no comprehensive agreement. The Vietnamese withdrawal proceeded. It has not been verified internationally. We assume that Vietnamese combat units are no longer in Cambodia. We believe there probably are a certain number of Vietnamese advisors, specialists of one kind or another, who are in Cambodia. But essentially the Vietnamese withdrawal of combat units has been completed. The situation then is that we're still without an agreement. Fighting has picked up in recent weeks. There have been some inroads made by both the Khmer Rouge and the non-communist resistance against the Phnom Penh government. As the dry season gets drier and the rice paddies dry out, fighting may perhaps pick up even further, with the situation more advantageous for the Phnom Penh army, inasmuch as it has things like tanks, which it can use then, can't use yet. In any event, I think it perhaps was true, unfortunately, that all of the Cambodian factions, the non-communists, the Khmer Rouge, and the PRK, did see this period that we are in right now as a time in which the balance of power on the ground in Cambodia would become clearer. in the absence for the first time of the distorting factor of a large Vietnamese military presence. We do not regard it as inevitable, however, that this period of testing should be permitted to go on and that it inevitably must go on. We believe it's important to try to restart negotiations as soon as this can be done. And we're trying to do that. We do that via our contacts with all of the players to this situation, with the exception of the PRK. And in particular, we think there is a useful role to be played by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which 4 of whom at least, leaving out the British for this purpose, have particular relationships with the factions in Cambodia. And we believe this is a venue of negotiation, a level of negotiation at which we can and should be active, and we are. There have been regional efforts. There is talk of another informal meeting in Jakarta. This is going to go on. I think we want to attempt to accelerate the process as much as reality will permit it to be accelerated. And I remain cautiously optimistic that a formal negotiating forum can be reconstituted sometime in the not very distant future, in the spring perhaps, and that it perhaps can succeed where Paris failed. And what will be required will be, in my judgment, a modicum of flexibility on the part of the PRK and Hanoi with respect to the question of the transitional arrangement to be put in place. A comprehensive settlement has been called something that is far too ambitious. Self-determination for the Cambodian people, international guarantees, peacekeeping forces, arms moratoria. Why don't we just somehow throw our weight on the side of the PRK and battle it out? We remain convinced that a comprehensive settlement, complicated though it is, can come together. Complicated settlements have been worked out in the past and even have proven durable. A settlement of this kind with the support, not only the acquiescence, but the active support of all of the parties, particularly including China, could we think prove to be indeed a durable and lasting framework, and a settlement of that nature, in our view, remains the best, the surest way to prevent the Khmer Rouge from returning to power. It is not risk-free. It does not provide an absolute guarantee that the Khmer Rouge would not be able to exploit the situation and fight their way back into power. But in our judgment, it's far better than any alternative that has been put forward. The alternative to a negotiated settlement of the Cambodian conflict essentially being no negotiated settlement and unfettered, uncontrolled civil warfare in which the Khmer Rouge could well win. We believe a comprehensive framework can establish the sufficient controls that the Khmer Rouge can indeed be contained, their strength gradually eroded as the conflict is moved from a military to a political context. And in the political arena, we're quite convinced, and I believe everyone would agree, that the Khmer Rouge would not and could not win. Thank you very much.
Nowhere in American foreign policy are we faced with a more tangled moral thicket than in our policy in regards to Cambodia. I think in order to understand where the United States is today and what the problem is, it's important to understand some of the aspects of the history. To understand the fact that in 1979, when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge regime and stopped the killing fields, that at that time the Khmer Rouge was totally devastated. Totally devastated at that time, and they were rebuilt primarily by the Chinese, to some extent by the Thais, and rebuilt with the acquiescence and the quiet support of the United States, who felt that the Khmer Rouge were the only viable military force which could end the Vietnamese occupation. That act, and that single act, I think will go down in history as one of the greatest moral transgressions of American foreign policy ever, and we're living with the consequences of that. Subsequent to that time, the United States helped engineer the coalition government, which included the Khmer Rouge, which included the forces of former Prime Minister Lon Nol and the so-called Son San faction, and also included the Sihanoukists and the Sihanouk forces. Sihanouk and Son Sen did not voluntarily go into a coalition with the Khmer Rouge. They were forced by the United States. In the case of Sihanouk, he was at his palatial estate in Beijing. The U.S. sent a high-level diplomat to him to inform Sihanouk that if he would not enter into that coalition, that Sihanouk would cease to have any support from the U.S. We cut off, in the case of Son San, who was living in Bangkok at the time, cut off his water supplies from his home in Bangkok. His food supplies put him under virtual house arrest until he agreed to enter into the coalition with the Khmer Rouge. And at that time, we then went and included and engineered at the UN the seating of the government, which is nominally headed by the Khmer Rouge, at the UN as the government of Cambodia. The United States is today living with the consequences of that act. And what our policy has been in terms of getting a peaceful settlement or a comprehensive settlement in Cambodia, our policy has been one of insisting on power sharing. Power sharing sounds like a wonderful thing. It sounds like a chant that we should have with the forces of democracy in the streets. Power sharing means one thing. It means the simple premise of our policy, which is that in order to assure that the Khmer Rouge is never able to return to power in Cambodia, we must insist and assure that they are included as a part of an interim government. Now, I have a fundamental law of foreign policy which I plagiarized from my wife, and that is that if you have a policy which cannot be explained to a group of the general public in this country in 30 seconds or less and doesn't make sense to them on first blush, then you ought to seriously re-examine that policy. And indeed, what happened in the Paris peace talks, and the reason that the peace talks foundered, was because of two issues. The United States strongly supported Sihanouk, and Sihanouk's position was very clear. The first was the issue of removing language in the protocol which said that Cambodia shall never return to the genocidal policies of the past. This was a major issue. It was a major issue because once you excluded that language, you began the process of sending the Khmer Rouge off to the Daidi laundry service to be sanitized. That was the beginning of the process of sanitizing the Khmer Rouge and rewriting the history of the killing fields. The second issue was the issue of power sharing. The only legitimacy that the Hun Sen government that was installed by the Vietnamese has, their only legitimacy is the fact that they were the thing that has prevented the Khmer Rouge from returning to power. So the United States was, in my estimation, on the wrong side of both issues. And we continue to maintain that we will punish anybody who will not support the concept of power sharing, which includes the Khmer Rouge. It's dead wrong, and I think it's a policy that you cannot sell to the American public. Fundamental premise behind that policy is, first, that China, since China is the main backer of the Khmer Rouge, since the Chinese view the Khmer Rouge genocide as merely revolutionary excesses that took place, revolutionary zeal, and since Cambodia and the Cambodia policy is one of the few strands, thin threads that holds the United States and China and gives us something to talk about, that we should pay enormous deference to China on this issue. And it's part of, frankly, what I think is a totally upside-down policy. The United States today is insisting on including the Khmer Rouge in the government of Cambodia in order to placate the Chinese. We sell arms to the Chinese after the Tiananmen Square massacre in order to keep the Chinese happy. And President Bush, just several weeks ago, vetoed legislation which would provide basic protections in this country under our immigration law from deportation of the Chinese students who were caught here after Tiananmen Square. That policy is nonsense, but it has given us for the first time an opportunity for liberal Democrats like Steve Solars and Chet Atkins to blast a conservative Republican administration for being too soft on a communist regime. And at least we have returned to put us in that position. But what has happened is, in addition to our enormous deference to China, this issue, we have also had a total phobia about Hun Sen and about the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese occupation was wrong. The Vietnamese invasion was not wrong. That was the only thing that stopped the killing fields. They didn't do it, unfortunately, out of great humanitarian concerns. They did it for simple concerns of national security, but they did it nonetheless. The United States, almost nobody paid attention at that time to the devastation wrought by the Khmer Rouge, with the exception, and one of the first Americans, certainly the first member of Congress and of our government, to raise his voice clearly in terms of the devastation, was my colleague, Congressman Steve Solars. And I think all of us owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to him for his work for more than a decade now on Cambodia policy. But once the Vietnamese invaded, and unfortunately they continued their occupation past the time when they should have, did it, but now the Vietnamese have withdrawn. And part of the game that we're playing in U.S. policy is twofold with Vietnam. Number one, to not acknowledge publicly that indeed, for all intents and purposes, the Vietnamese have withdrawn from Cambodia, and that the Hun Sen government, indeed, while it doesn't have total autonomy, has significant autonomy from Vietnamese policies, particularly on the domestic side, if not totally in their foreign relations. The second thing is that we continue to be obsessed with Vietnam. We refuse, having steadfastly maintained for a period of more than 5 years that the only obstacle to normalizing U.S.-Vietnamese relations was Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia. We have now changed that, say the only obstacle is to Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia in the context of a negotiated settlement. A negotiated settlement means the Vietnamese acquiescence in the Khmer Rouge being involved in a power-sharing arrangement. Frankly, I think our objections to the Vietnamese lack of willingness to include the Khmer Rouge in power-sharing are dead wrong. And I believe that the vast majority of the American public would agree with that and do not want to see the Khmer Rouge included in any kind of interim power-sharing arrangement in Cambodia. But having dealt with that with the Vietnamese, we now have an obsession about the Hun Sen government. The Hun Sen government, and I wish with all of my heart that the Hun Sen government was a government of wise and just men and women. It's not. It's a government that's had significant human rights abuses. It's a government that has had and created enormous problems and still has more Vietnamese influence than it should. But it is the only thing between the Cambodian people and a return to power for the Khmer Rouge. The United States, I think, needs to recognize that. We need to have a policy which will accept the fact that the Hun Sen government is in place, is a government that has considerable fealty from the Cambodian people because they have blocked a return to power of the Khmer Rouge, and begin to negotiate on that basis rather than trying to do what we're doing now. What we're doing now is what we did in the 60s in Southeast Asia, in Laos, in Cambodia, and in South Vietnam. There were governments that, in a broad sense of the word, could be considered having governed with the consent of the governed and with some degree of democracy, rejection of democracy, but they weren't quite to the U.S.'s liking. So we sat, and in the case of Laos, in an international forum, in the other cases with coups that we plotted, and we tried to devise a different structure that was a little bit more to our liking. And that's what we're trying to do now in Cambodia. As the Hun Sen isn't to our liking, we want to include something and force something that's a little bit different. Well, the problem is that you can't take a very elegant diplomatic construct that's fashioned in Washington and in Paris and in New York and try to impose it on the reality on the ground in Cambodia, which is a country that's faced, as Nyan Chanda said, enormous devastation. A country that has started to rebuild under the Hun Sen regime, and a country that should be opened up to the international community. We have seen enough desolation, fear, and isolation in Cambodia. It's time for us to have a policy that's guided from some firm moral principles, a policy that recognizes history, and a policy that puts at its primary objective assuring that the Khmer Rouge will never return to power, either permanently or temporarily, in Cambodia. Thank you.
Having been rejected as an applicant to Harvard College, Harvard Graduate School, and Harvard Law School, I always take a special pleasure in the opportunity to speak before audiences in Cambridge. And it is for that reason, among others, that I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you tonight about the situation in Cambodia and its implications for American foreign policy. I'm also honored to be able to join an extremely prestigious panel in tonight's deliberations. In David Lambertson, we have someone who has probably worked longer and harder to bring an end to the Cambodian conflict than anybody in the United States government. In Chet Atkins, we have someone who has made the need for a solution to the Cambodian problem one of his major personal and political priorities, not because he has many Cambodians in his constituency, but because for him this is one of the primary moral challenges confronting our country today. In David Hawke, we have someone who has devoted much of his life over the course of the last decade to the effort to catalog the crimes of Pol Pot and his murderous minions, and who, in many respects, has emerged as the conscience of our country on this complex question. And in Nyan Chanda, we have probably the single most knowledgeable person in all of America about the politics, personalities, and problems of that tragic and troubled land. I have to say, speaking for myself, that in my 15 years in the United States Congress, I have never dealt with a more complex issue from both a moral and political perspective than the problem of Cambodia. It seems to me, now that Vietnam has by and large withdrawn its forces from Cambodia, that we have two primary objectives as a nation in dealing with the Cambodian problem. The first is to prevent Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge from returning once again to power in Phnom Penh. The reestablishment of their rule in Cambodia would be morally unacceptable and politically unthinkable. And secondly, if at all possible, we should certainly strive to facilitate a resolution of the Cambodian conflict that would permit an act of genuine self-determination on the part of the Cambodian people. It is not very difficult to criticize American policy toward Cambodia. The real challenge is to come up with alternative approaches that would have a better chance of advancing these important objectives than the policy which we have pursued to date. One thing seems very clear to me, and that is that the best way to prevent Pol Pot from returning to power in Phnom Penh lies in the context of a comprehensive political settlement of the conflict, if it can be achieved, which would bring the fighting to an end and which would make possible an internationally supervised, free and fair election in which the Khmer Rouge would have about as much chance of winning as the Democratic Party does in Orange County in California. Question, of course, is how to achieve such a settlement. So far, the proposals that have been put forward by the various parties to the conflict have proven to be mutually, and I might say understandably, unacceptable. Hun Sen, speaking for the People's Republic of Kampuchea, now renamed as the State of Cambodia, has said that a settlement should be based on an acceptance of the existing PRK regime and a subsequent election under some kind of international observation. This has been rejected by not only the non-communist resistance forces led by Prince Sihanouk and Son Sann, and by the Khmer Rouge as well, but also by China, the ASEAN countries, the United States, and all of our Western allies. First, because it would require the legitimization of what everyone believes to be an illegitimate government, installed not by a free and fair vote of the Cambodian people, but by the bayonets of the Vietnamese army. And secondly, because there is a widespread belief, which I have not yet heard anyone credibly challenge, that no election conducted within the framework of the PRK regime could possibly be free or fair, as a result of which the Cambodian people would once again be denied the opportunity to genuinely determine their own destiny. The coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, supported by ASEAN and China and the United States, has put forward an alternative proposal. They have called for the dissolution of the PRK regime and the establishment of an interim quadripartite government in which each of the four Cambodian factions would be represented, together with an international peacekeeping force and an internationally supervised free and fair election. This proposal has been rejected by Mr. Hun Sen and his associates in Phnom Penh on the grounds, first, that it would require them to relinquish the power they already enjoy, and secondly, because they fear the consequences for Cambodia of giving the Khmer Rouge an opportunity to participate in an interim administration. On the first point, I have to say I have little sympathy for Mr. Hun Sen. On the second, however, I think he knows whereof he speaks. I, too, am deeply concerned about the implications of including the Khmer Rouge in an interim administration. I don't think anybody can seriously doubt that they retain their ambition to seize control over all of Cambodia. The notion that the Khmer Rouge have in any way changed their colors or their stripes is nothing more than a mirage in the desert. The very fact that the Khmer Rouge refer to the auto-genocide which they imposed on Cambodia as a mistake is in and of itself sufficient indication to conclude that they have not changed their ways. The fact that they have claimed that Pol Pot a few years ago went into retirement when he continues to rule the Khmer Rouge is another indication of their continuing duplicity. The brutal manner in which they treat those Khmers unfortunate enough to be trapped in the camps which they control is additional evidence of what might be anticipated if the Khmer Rouge were to return to power once again in Phnom Penh. And my fear is that a political settlement which gives the Khmer Rouge a role in an interim administration would enable Pol Pot to simultaneously subvert the administration from within while continuing to attack it from without. So I'm in favor of a comprehensive political settlement, but it has to be the right kind of comprehensive political settlement, because a political settlement could very easily backfire and produce precisely the result we want to avoid if it is not a settlement which is compatible not only with the realities on the ground, but with the imperative necessity of preventing the Khmer Rouge from returning to power. It seems to me, therefore, that the time has come for some new thinking in American foreign policy about Cambodia. We have to focus on the need for a formula which will make it possible to achieve an end to the conflict and an internationally supervised free and fair election. The reason I think we need an end to the conflict is that in the context of a continuation of the fighting, the Khmer Rouge, as we've already heard, have a very real possibility of battling their way back to power in Phnom Penh. They are, after all, the fiercest and potentially the most formidable of the four Cambodian factions. And while Hun Sen professes a measure of confidence about the capacity of his government to contain the Khmer Rouge, it may yet turn out that the PRK is nothing more than a house of cards which falls down at the first blast from the Khmer Rouge. I think we would be making a very serious mistake if we decided at this stage of the Cambodian game that the only way, let alone the best way, to prevent the Khmer Rouge from returning to power was to lend our nominal support to the PRK regime. And let me say parenthetically on that point that if we're living in the real world, we have to understand that that's simply not a viable political possibility. Can anyone seriously imagine that the Bush administration, or for that matter, even the Congress of the United States, would be prepared to provide any kind of meaningful material assistance, let alone to politically and diplomatically recognize a government installed by a Vietnamese army of invasion, a government led by men, every one of whom were themselves part of the Khmer Rouge killing machine when Pol Pot was in power between 1975 and 1979, and a regime which is not recognized by any other country in the region. Whatever the theoretical merits of such a vision may be, and I have to say, to me, they're not self-evident. So practical political reality is an option which is simply not before us. So if the problem is going to be solved, the political resolution of the conflict will be necessary. And as I've thought about this, and I've thought about it a good deal, it seems to me that the best hope for a solution lies in the establishment of a UN-supervised interim administration, which would be accompanied by a substantial international peacekeeping force, which would then be given the responsibility not only for verifying the withdrawal of Vietnam and of a ceasefire and of the termination of all external assistance to the various Cambodian factions and the disarmament of the four armies now in the field, but also the supervision of a truly free and fair election so that the Cambodian people could determine their own destiny. Such a settlement, not unlike the one we've just witnessed in Namibia, would involve the dispatch by the Secretary General of the United Nations of a special representative to Phnom Penh, who would assume responsibility for the administration of Cambodia in an interim period between the beginning of a ceasefire and the holding of an internationally supervised election. It presupposes the formal dissolution of the PRK regime, together with the formal dissolution of the CGDK, but it assumes the continuation in place of the existing PRK bureaucracy, albeit under the supervision of the United Nations. Now, some may say that this would be a consummation devoutly to be wished, but it is not particularly realistic. I have to say I'm not overly optimistic that such a formula would in fact constitute the basis for a resolution of the Cambodian conflict. But I am absolutely convinced that there is a better chance for the success of such a proposal than there is for either of the other formulas which are already on the table, both of which have already been rejected. It seems to me that if one analyzes the attractiveness of such a formula for the various parties and countries to the conflict, it becomes clear that each would benefit in a variety of different ways from the acceptance of such an arrangement. From the point of view of the non-communist resistance, it would bring the fighting to an end. It would result in the dissolution of the PRK regime. It would facilitate the introduction of a substantial international peacekeeping force, and it would lead to truly free and fair elections in which they would have a very good chance of winning a substantial share of the vote. From the point of view of China, whose support for such a proposal would be absolutely essential, it would have a number of benefits as well. First, it would result in the dissolution of the PRK regime, thereby, from Beijing's perspective, depriving Hanoi of a victory in Cambodia. Secondly, although it would not provide for the participation of the Khmer Rouge in the interim administration, it would put the Khmer Rouge, to which the Chinese apparently feel they have certain residual loyalties and obligations, on a par with the other factions, inasmuch as each of the factions would be given the opportunity to participate in the elections as a political party. And given, furthermore, the extent to which Beijing's international reputation has suffered somewhat as a result of the massacre in Tiananmen Square, a constructive Chinese role in facilitating such a settlement would clearly help to enhance their international stature at this present juncture in world affairs. From the point of view of Vietnam, such a settlement would, among other things, undoubtedly lead to normalization of relations with the United States and the end of the international isolation which has been imposed upon them. That, it would seem to me, would be a very significant benefit indeed. From the point of view of Hun Sen and the PRK, while they would be obligated to relinquish power during the interim period, it would exclude the Khmer Rouge from any participation in an interim government. It would bring an end to the fighting, thereby diminishing the possibility that the Khmer Rouge could eventually battle their way back to power in Phnom Penh. It would, perhaps most significantly, result in a break in the connection between China and the Khmer Rouge, because China would be obligated to stop supporting the Khmer Rouge. And finally, if Mr. Hun Sen is nearly as popular as he claims to be, then he would have a very good chance of doing well in the elections and of having a major role to play in any future Cambodian government. I should also add that in the context of such a settlement, Hun Sen could expect massive amounts of international assistance for the relief and reconstruction of Cambodia. From the point of view of the Soviet Union, such a settlement would bring an end to another troublesome regional conflict in a much cleaner fashion than they were able to achieve in the case of Afghanistan, and would further contribute to Mr. Gorbachev's efforts to reduce superpower tensions. So I think that this is an idea whose time may have come. I'm very pleased to note that the Foreign Minister of Australia, Senator Gareth Evans, has already formally put forward this suggestion in a speech he gave a short while ago in the Australian Senate. Prince Sihanouk and Mr. Sonsan have publicly indicated their receptivity to the idea. A number of the other ASEAN leaders in private have suggested that they are sympathetic to it as well. We have yet to hear from China, Vietnam, or the Soviet Union. And I regret to say that so far our own administration has not yet formally pronounced judgment on this proposal. I urge them to do so, not only because I think such an initiative is substantively sound, and not only because I think it constitutes a much surer basis for the achievement of our objectives in Cambodia, but also because I believe it is a politically sustainable policy. If we continue to support, as the administration has done, the concept of a political settlement based on a quadripartite interim government for all of the reasons Chet Atkins has so eloquently expressed, it is not a policy which can be sustained. Aside from Mr. Lambertson, I find few others in the administration who have the courage or the chutzpah, as it were, to publicly defend it. But one is but to read the editorial pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and God knows how many other newspapers in the country to see the policy attacked day in and day out. So we are at a juncture, in conclusion, where the fate of Cambodia may literally hang in the balance. If it's going to be saved, if the Khmer Rouge are going to be prevented from returning, it will probably require a political settlement. And if we're going to have a political settlement, we need some new thinking, which breaks from the stale and tired formulas of the past, and which is based on some new initiatives, which provide something for everybody, but most of all, for the people of Cambodia themselves. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I don't remember a forum event where the range of policy available and to the U.S. government discussed in such concise terms has been here. It was really quite excellent, a presentation by all of you. Now we would like to turn to our two discussants that we would like to have both David Hawk and Nyan Chanda comment on this presentation by these three policymakers in our government. And at their conclusion, we will then open it up for your questions. Now I would like to introduce to you David Hawk. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Kennedy School.
Thank you. If we're
fine, please stay right
respondents,
there.
perhaps we can break the pattern, and
Sure.
Nyan and I can respond from our seats. As if Solars, Atkins, and Chanda wasn't enough to give Mr. Lambertson a hard time, they invited me. And if that wasn't sufficient, they had also originally invited a Cambodian whose name did not happen to make it on the advertisements for this meeting, but whose name is Cassie New, who was to have been with us tonight, but he was coming up from Washington and didn't catch an early enough plane and got snowed in. But he asked me if I would say a few things on his behalf, so I will. The first of which is to thank Congressman Atkins for his impassioned advocacy on behalf of Cambodia over the years, and to encourage Congressman Atkins to continue his forceful advocacy as the crisis in Cambodia gets even worse. Secondly, Cassie asked me to thank on his behalf Congressman Solars for his efforts during the Khmer Rouge years in power to bring their crimes to public awareness, for his advocacy in the early and mid-'80s of increased U.S. assistance to the non-communists, and for his advocacy today of what he called the UN trusteeship idea, which Congressman Solars doesn't properly identify it in that way, because that would be contrary to one of the articles of the Charter of the UN. But in any event, for putting forward an idea that merits further explanation. Now, in that regard, on behalf of myself, I would hope that the U.S. would give a lot more consideration to this very shortly, and that maybe an American and a U.S. diplomat could go to Phnom Penh and explain to Hun Sen what this new idea entails, so that if it is rejected, it's not rejected out of hand. Probably it's going to be rejected until the Hunsan Regime is on the verge of collapse. Hopefully they will see the merits of it before it's too late, and I would hope that the Australians and Americans can go to Phnom Penh and explain it to Hun Sen so he won't reject it before it's too late for it to work. I'll try to respond on a couple of points. I've had the opportunity to testify to the Asia Subcommittee over the years. Usually, David Lambertson has preceded my testimony and then left. So I hope, since I've okay, but I've had the opportunity to express my views publicly to Congressman Solars and Atkins on a number of occasions. So I hope Mr. Lambertson, up until a year and a half ago, my own differences with U.S. policy toward Cambodia would have been more over the nuance than the exact things that they were saying. That is, for a number of years at Congressman Solar's hearings, I've testified on behalf of more aid to the Cambodian people inside Cambodia, more help to the refugees on the border, more efforts to weaken the Khmer Rouge, and more efforts to strengthen the non-communists. However, in light of the recent changes in Cambodia over the last year and the developments in international diplomacy, I now find myself at considerable odds with a policy which I now think is illogical, unrealistic, counterproductive, and in gross default on the moral and legal obligations of the United States as a states party to the Genocide Convention. Cambodia does present U.S. policy with a hard choice, conflicting interests, the choice between going along with good relations with our primary allies in Asia and countries with whom the strategic balance in the world is held to be the major aspect of U.S. security and national interests, and doing something that would regard the Cambodians as someone a people in and of themselves, and not as an adjunct to U.S.-China policy or U.S.-Vietnam policy. I think the current policy is illogical because essentially we're supporting a civil war in the name of a formula to avoid a civil war. I think it's illogical. Secondly, because while the U.S. says that we're opposed to the participation of the Khmer Rouge in the former Cambodian government, and Mr. Lambertson testifies repeatedly that it is for the Cambodians themselves to decide whether or not the Khmer Rouge should be allowed to participate. In fact, the Hun Sen government or administration agrees with U.S. policy. Nonetheless, the U.S. turns around and blames Hun Sen for essentially sticking to the U.S. policy position and not going along with what's called a comprehensive solution, which means an interim quadripartite coalition government. I think that formula, as has been mentioned by others, is completely unrealistic. I don't think that the non-communist parties, I'm sorry to say, can uphold their 25% in this formula as it's been articulated. And I think that the attempt to achieve a interim quadripartite coalition government arrangement is basically unmanageable. If you look closely at what the details of that arrangement are, and those details are available in a paper put out by the CDGK called the Modalities for the Implementation of the Five-Point Plan. It's what a quadripartite interim coalition government means is also available in the submissions by the CDGK to the ad hoc committee at the Paris conference. That includes the Khmer Rouge, genuine quadripartite arrangement, and that means Khmer Rouge participation in the ministries of defense, interior, foreign relations, and information. That is, if you look at the breakdown of the negotiations in Paris between what the French proposed and what the CDGK insisted on, they held out for an arrangement that would bring the Khmer Rouge back not only into the government, but in what they call all levels of administration from top to bottom, unquote. That means every village in Cambodia gets to have the Khmer Rouge back in their administration. It also means that the Khmer Rouge goes back into the army. It means they go back into the Ministry of Interior. The Ministry of Interior in Cambodia runs the police, which is called Norcabal. It runs the prisons. The policy, which the U.S. says, I'm sorry to say, is reasonable and practical, or the reasonable basis for negotiations, would allow the Khmer Rouge to go back to Phnom Penh with their guns, be in the police, be in Norcabal, that is to say, be back with their guns in the legitimate organs of state coercion and power. They would have the powers of arrest, they would have the powers of interrogation. And there is nothing in any of the CDGK proposals that would preclude the involvement of the top Khmer Rouge leadership. That's something that Sihanouk talks about, Son Sann talks about, the U.S. talks about, but the idea of precluding the involvement in political power by the former and present members of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party of Kampuchea is nowhere provided for in any of the proposals put forward by the UN or put forward in Paris for the resolution of the Cambodian conflict. I think U.S. policy at the present time just won't work. I don't think it can be managed. I think if the Khmer Rouge get by negotiations or by arms strength anywhere near as close to power as they are entitled to under the CDGK Sihanouk plan, that in fact Hun Sen's government will collapse. I don't think there's any evidence that that government has a lot of support in Cambodia. I think its support is shallow, it's not deep, it's a fragile regime. We've seen armies collapse in a lot of places. We've seen states' administrations collapse. It's happening in quite a number of communist countries these days. And I think that if the Khmer Rouge get anywhere close to the plan that's outlined by the CDGK, allows them that amount of power, that Hun Sen's administration and government is going to collapse, and that will allow the Khmer Rouge to turn and eliminate their non-communist allies, which if you talk to Khmer Rouge defectors in the refugee camps in Thailand, that's exactly what they say they're going to do. They're going to get rid of the traitors first who sold their country to the Vietnamese, and then they're going to turn on what they describe as the lackeys of the imperialists, by which they mean Sihanouk and Son Sann. So I think that U.S. policy at the present time is actually counterproductive, in that while it purports to support the non-communist, U.S. policy is actually doing in Sihanouk and Son Sann. That if Hun Sen can prevail under the current situation, there won't be any reason for him to negotiate a power-sharing arrangement with Sihanouk and Son Sann. And if Hun Sen is broken, as I think the U.S. is conducting its policy now, which is intended to break the will of Hun Sen to oppose the return to power by the Khmer Rouge faction. If U.S. policy in this succeeds, I think Sihanouk and Son Sann are going to be done in too. Sihanouk may be able to go back to Phnom Penh because he will have Chinese protection. But you ask people in ANS, you ask other people in Phun Sen Pek or the KPNLF, if Hun Sen government falls, if it's a coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, are they going to go back to Phnom Penh? They'll tell you that they're not. And I think it's very dangerous what's going on now because I don't think the situation will be managed. Lastly, I'm sorry to go on longer than I should, but I think the U.S. is also now in gross default on its moral and legal obligations as a state party to the Genocide Convention. 2 years ago, Cambodians in the United States appealed not only to the United States but all other parties to the Genocide Convention, and they similarly wrote to President Reagan asking the United States to take action under the terms and provisions of the Genocide Convention against those most responsible for the Cambodian genocide. Responding, I think it was during your first weeks in office, but responding on behalf of President Reagan, David Lambertson said to the Cambodians who wrote to him, the administration's position on the Khmer Rouge is well known. We abhor their brutality and disregard for human rights, oppose their return to power. The mass murder of hundreds of thousands of Cambodians during the Pol Pot period chillingly resembles in scale and barbarity the Nazi genocide against the Jews during World War II. We hope that justice awaits those responsible for the horrors of that period. I assure you that we share the deep and lasting concern that the Khmer Rouge leaders responsible for the tragedy in Cambodia be punished, if for no other reason than to serve as a warning to others who may be tempted to commit similar crimes. That's from Secretary Lambertson's letter of May 13, 1987 to Mr. Yang Sam. He went on to say in the letter that the United States had not ratified yet the Genocide Convention, so was not in a position to take action to bring to justice those responsible for the Cambodian genocide. That was true in May of 1987. Subsequently, the United States has become a party to the Genocide Convention. In light of the fact that the U.S. is now a full-fledged member to the Genocide Convention, I would ask Secretary Lambertson to explain what actions the United States is now taking to bring to justice those responsible for the Genocide Convention, why the United States does not submit a complaint under Article 9 to the International Court of Justice to bring the Khmer Rouge state of Democratic Kampuchea to explain to the World Court why it committed crimes prohibited by the Genocide Convention and why it has failed to bring to justice those responsible. And secondly, why, contrary to the joint resolution passed by Congress and signed into law by President Reagan, the United States in the UN forum does not, why the U.S. Goes along with a resolution that clears the way for Pol Pot's return to power, and why the U.S. does not insist, along with other democratic countries, along with other states parties to the Genocide Convention, on the inclusion of a provision that those responsible for massive violations of internationally recognized human rights should not be enabled to return to positions of political power in Cambodia after the withdrawal of the foreign occupation forces. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for those that analysis and that comment and that question. I take it as directed to Secretary Lambertson. You want to respond at all, quickly, or whatever?
What would you like me to do? Respond now, or wait until 9?
Why don't we? If it's my judgment would be that if you could respond now, I think that would be.
All right. Let me respond to 2 or 3 points that David was making. At one point, your contention is that a quadripartite coalition government is unworkable and probably immoral as well, and that the United States, as an advocate of that, is consequently embarked on a policy that is both tactically as well as morally wrong. We are not the inventor or advocate of a quadripartite formula for getting Cambodia through a transition period into a fair and credible election. We were, in fact, recent and very reluctant acquiescers in that kind of formula. It was the mandate of the Paris Conference, formally and in terms of the policies of virtually every participant in it, that any solution to be workable and to fit and to comport with the unpleasant realities on the ground in Cambodia had to be one in which all of the factions took part in some fashion. And so we have stated that while our own strong preference would be that the Khmer Rouge have no role henceforth in the political life of Cambodia, that we would not stand in the way of a settlement in which they did have a role, and we would work to minimize that role. And in our future relationship with any Cambodian government, whether interim or permanent, the degree of a relationship that we could have would be directly affected by the size and prominence of Khmer Rouge participation in the government. We, therefore, are not out on the front lines and have not been pressing for a quadripartite solution, 50-50, 25% for each faction, or any other mathematical permutation of power sharing. We don't have a favorite formula. We only know that there will have to be an arrangement reached whereby each of the factions can have some confidence that their interests are being taken care of politically during this important transition leading to an election, in which each faction's ability to monopolize power or in any particular area, each faction's ability to undermine agreements will to some extent be constrained and neutralized. If there's a magic formula, we haven't found it, and there is no American plan, no American formula for quadripartite or tripartite or bipartite power sharing. We simply know that the factions are going to have to agree on some formula. And let me digress here and say something preliminarily and informally about the idea of a United Nations role in the administration of Cambodia. I think the idea has great merit. It interests me very much. It has many of the advantages, I believe, that Congressman Solars so eloquently stated. The reason we have not had a settlement in Cambodia, the reason the fighting is still going on in Cambodia, the reason the question of justice for the perpetrators of genocide in Cambodia has not, and in fact, in my judgment, cannot effectively be addressed, is that we have not been able to get around the very large and difficult impasse on the question of what has been called power sharing or transitional arrangements, the political solution to this conflict. And conceivably, a plan such as Congressman Solars has put forward could provide a way around that impasse. And I'm acutely aware as well that we have had some difficulty generating mass popular demonstrations in behalf of the United States government's approach to this issue. And for that reason, too, if there is something to be gained politically, domestically, I'd be happy to latch on to it.
Secretary, thank you very much.
May I simply add one more point, or to reiterate? I think the question before us is how to break the difficult impasse on power sharing. It's as difficult as Congressman Solars so aptly described it. There are conditions that either one party or the other would have to meet to make it come together that demonstrably have proven difficult to surmount. Now, I would add that in my view, the greatest need remains for flexibility on the part of the Phnom Penh regime and its backer, Vietnam. This would, I think, be true whether we were talking about power sharing in conventional terms or if the idea put forward by Congressman Solars were further developed. The essential requirement for a political solution in Cambodia is for the Phnom Penh regime in some measure to agree to a dilution of its monopoly on power. But perhaps the proposal of Congressman Solars would provide a way to achieve that as well.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Secretary. We are under some time constraint. Nyan Chandra, if you could comment, and then we'll have questions.
Listening to the discussion like this evening and many other discussions on Cambodia, I sometimes wonder whether we are talking about a country which has 6 to 7 million people living willingly, unwillingly under a regime called PRK, and 350,000 refugees, displaced persons so-called, at the border. Now, we are talking always in terms of 3 factions, 4 factions, some people organizing themselves into political parties seeking power. But how about the Cambodian people? Has anybody bothered to go to the country, talk to a range of people in Cambodia to find out how do the Cambodian people feel about so-called 3-party, 4-party formulas? Just think of you visiting the survivors of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and you are asking them that the people who are torturing you, murdering you, have proved themselves a good anti-Soviet fighters. And now we should, for the sake of stability and peace in Germany, we should let these guys come back and take part in the new government in Germany, which would be a strong and independent and united country. The notion that the Khmer Rouge can come back interim, one faction, or 1/5 of power or 1/4 of power, the whole idea is abhorrent to the Cambodian people. So that to keep on talking about this faction distribution of power is total disregard of the reality on the ground in Cambodia. Now, other question is, when one talks of the Khmer Rouge, who are the Khmer Rouge? Are we talking about a neat political organization that we can say, okay, you are now asked to do this, you sign on a piece of paper, and you abide by the agreement you have signed? We are talking about a small group, Pol Pot, Tamok, Nuon Chia, Ieng Sari, Duc. Duc, incidentally, is the man who was in charge of the prison in Phnom Penh, where 20,000 people were killed, tortured. And he is now the Minister of Interior of the Khmer Rouge. And these are the people we are saying that they should go back and play a role, interim role, in a small way. Now, unless you tell the Cambodian people that these murderers have to be put away, arrangements are being made for their exile, for their trial, only then the Khmer Rouge organization, the rank and file or people who have survived, who are unwilling partners, can go back and associate themselves or join the Cambodian society. But without addressing the question of what happens to Pol Pot, Ieng Sari, Tamok, Nuon Chia, Duc, the question of Khmer Rouge playing any role whatsoever amounts to calling on the murderers to come back and play a political role.
Thank you very much, Nyan Chanda. Go to Hawk. We do have time for a few direct questions. The arrangements to get the panel here, we try to keep within some time constraints. Those that would like questions, please line up at the microphones. The first question in this conference will go to the organizer of one of the organizers of the conference. I guess it'll be we'll try to move them up there. Roger Norman, who has some experience himself on the Thai-Cambodian border, and he will ask the first question this evening. Roger.
Okay, I appreciated Mr. Chanda's attempt to bring the more human element in this great political discussion. And my experience has only been with the 350,000 refugees along the border, not with the millions inside Cambodia. So I'm going to ask my question directed at Secretary Lambertson, but I'd like to hear anyone's answer on the panel.
I think the line is so long and the time is so short. Please select one.
Okay, Secretary Lambertson then. I'll ask since he's on the firing line, it seems. Now, Congressman Soulard said that the Cambodians under Khmer Rouge control are trapped along the border. I worked in the non-communist camps, and I would say, and I think if you ask anyone who spent significant time there, that even the majority, if not the vast majority, are trapped in the non-communist camps also, because there's barbed wire around them, there are Thai soldiers, there are Khmer soldiers, there are mines. The vast majority would like to go back, not under a comprehensive settlement, not with the UN, just walk back across their farmers, but they are prevented because of the relief operation, because of the coalition government, and because of our support of the coalition government, and I would say also of UNBRO. Now, I would just like to ask the rationale of, we supply tens of millions of dollars a year to the relief organization and politically support the coalition, which does not allow freedom of movement for 350,000 people who are currently along the border. And I would like to just ask why that is. What is the justification, unless it's just a geopolitical one, that they need those people under their control? What is the justification for supporting that policy, not at least giving them the choice to go back if they'd like to?
Our policy is that the people along the border should have the opportunity to be repatriated in safety, dignity, free choice, all of that. That was an area in which there was broad agreement in Paris, and that would be an element in a comprehensive settlement, and it ought to be, in my view, dealt with in such a settlement. I don't know what percentage of people in the camps would like to go back to Cambodia immediately. I would think there would be a good deal of danger involved in doing that in the absence of a settlement of the conflict.
Okay. Please identify yourself. Any question too? Try
yes.
to mix it up a little.
My name is Vittipal Yem. I am a Cambodian resident in this area.
Atkins district.
Thank you. And I'm with the Hela School, Brandeis University. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk here. I have a comment rather than a question.
It should be brief then.
Yes, and maybe followed by a question. In response to Nayan Chanda's concern that about the Cambodian opinion of this confusing and complex problem, I would like to offer one of my own. I have listened to all the comments and concerns here tonight, and I haven't heard anything about the characteristic of the Hun Sen's government, so-called government, and I haven't heard any condemnation of the initial lie about the Vietnamese invasion in Cambodia.
Okay, should we take that in the form of a question? Somehow we need to be moving along here.
Okay, could I just finish it up in a second? Okay, when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia in 1979, the ambassador at the UN lied to the whole world in front of the Security Council that there was no Vietnamese troop inside Cambodia. And then they denied throughout the whole period until February of 1979, when they forced the Hunsan Regime government to sign a so-called friendship and cooperation treaty, which put Cambodia under their control for 25 years and is renewable every 25 years.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next question.
I'd like to ask Representative Solars. Mr. Solarz, you seem to be making the assumption in your proposal that the United Nations can now be turned to as a neutral and innocent instrument to restore, bring the settlement about. But in fact, is it not true, and is it not tragic for the world that the United Nations, in fact, has been used to be one of the major collaborating instruments in the rebuilding of the Khmer Rouge in two ways? One, the United Nations insisted on seating Pol Pot as the legitimate UN representative of Cambodia for first until 1985, I believe, by itself, and then in the coalition, and thereby cutting Cambodia off from vital UN development aid, number one. And number two, has the UN not presided over the administration of an international feeding program to the displaced camps, which actually was allowed to feed the Khmer Rouge armies?
Thank you. That's great. He's got it.
All this time. Those two things.
Yes. Well, I'm not in favor of an international food stamp program for the Khmer Rouge. To the extent that that may have gone on, it's unfortunate, and I oppose it. I also was not particularly pleased when the UN decided to permit Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to keep control of the seat at the UN after they were overthrown by the invading army of Vietnam. By the time they got around to giving the seat to the coalition, however, it was a somewhat different situation, because at that time, while the Khmer Rouge were still included, they were part of a larger coalition which also incorporated the non-communist resistance forces led by Prince Sihanouk and Son Sann. In any case, what concerns me now, frankly, is not engaging in sterile and unproductive debates over what should or should not have happened in the past, but how we can act in order to prevent the Khmer Rouge from returning in the future. And it seems to me the best way to do that is to shift the struggle for power now underway in Cambodia from the battlefield to the ballot box. In order to do that, you need a comprehensive settlement of the conflict. If it's not comprehensive in the sense that it is accepted by all the parties to the conflict, the fighting will continue. Furthermore, in the absence of a comprehensive settlement, there is no possibility whatsoever of bringing a significant, or for that matter even insignificant, international peacekeeping force into Cambodia to help in the task of preventing the Khmer Rouge from returning to power. International peacekeeping forces do not go into countries where fighting is going on. They generally only go into countries where those who have been fighting agree to stop fighting, which means that if you want an international peacekeeping force, if you want an end to the fighting, if you want an end to Chinese support for the Khmer Rouge, which is an essential element in depriving the Khmer Rouge of the ability to return to power, you need a comprehensive settlement. Now, you point out that the UN in the past has not been impartial about this. They have, in effect, opposed the illegitimate regime in Phnom Penh. And by the way, I'm glad they did. I think it would have been a serious mistake for the United Nations to have lent its legitimacy to a Cambodian regime which had no legitimacy, which wasn't elected by anybody in Cambodia, but which was installed by Vietnam. But I recognize that as a result of that, Hun Sen and his associates in the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party, a Marxist-Leninist party, a party unlike the parties in Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Poland, which has not yet relinquished its leading role in Cambodian society, is suspicious about the objectivity of the United Nations. Fine. As part of the solution I propose, let the Cambodian seat at the UN include Mr. Hun Sen and his representative as well, so that he would be in a position to help shape and determine the Cambodian vote at the United Nations. And that, it seems to me, would address his concerns quite adequately.
Thank you, Congressman. This microphone.
Is this working? Oh,
Who's the question to?
Well, I'd like to put it to the committee as a whole.
I'll select someone after you give the question, then.
You'll select someone, okay. Back in the 60s, people criticized U.S. foreign policy for associating itself with regimes in the Third World which had little claim to legitimacy and were tainted by former associations with colonialism, on the grounds that such regimes were unlikely to have any basis of popular support. Does not this argument apply today to Cambodia? And may we not talk a little bit more, and I'm afraid one of the things which disturbed me about particularly Nyan's account of the history was the lack of attention to the historical colonial relationship and ambition of Vietnam vis-a-vis Cambodia. Nyan, you know all the Cambodians better than most of us, and you know that hatred of Vietnam is a very, very profound sentiment which has a basis in 200 years of history. So my question with regard to this is how, and perhaps it might be best directed to Chester Atkins, because it was Congressman Atkins who raised the issue of the regime in Phnom Penh being the only thing that stands between us and the Khmer Rouge. What basis for a morally correct policy of resisting the return of genocidal killers is it to rely upon a colonial creation, especially when there are alternatives which have no such taint, and a policy of which has been advocated by Congressman Solar seems to me to be one which would give the people a chance to express their position.
We'll take two quick comments, first from Nyan and then from Congressman Atkins.
In fact, I did mention the Vietnamese ambition over Indochina. I did not say it in that historical order, but it is very clear that the Vietnamese have long held the view that security of Vietnam depends on who rules Cambodia and Laos. So that is self-evident, yes.
Congressman Atkins.
Let me just say very simply that I made it very clear in my remarks there aren't any white hats in this drama. We're dealing with a very hard and unforgiving reality. The fact of the matter is, and the reality on the ground, is that you've got the Khmer Rouge joined in coordinated military activities by the ANS, the Sihanouk forces, and by the Hunsan forces on the one hand, and you've got the Hunsan regime on the other. And given that, it's very clear that the only thing that stands between the Cambodian people, and it's not us, it's the Cambodian people, and a return to power by the Khmer Rouge is the Hunsan regime, whether you like it or not. The fact of the matter is that for the past 10 years, a regime that started out totally illegitimately, but was a regime that existed in a country where the entire infrastructure, I mean, when you killed everybody who spoke a foreign language, had any kind of education, wore glasses, many of the urban dwellers, they eliminated virtually all of the people with education, training, or experience in the bureaucracy. The regime has been forced, even though it is a Marxist-Leninist regime, it has been forced to reach out to a variety of different people to man the government just because there weren't any other sources. They had to take whoever was available. And I think if you look and if you go in on the ground in Cambodia and you see the kind of reconstruction that's taken place in this devastated country, that for all the human rights abuses and all the illegitimacy of the origins of the Hun Sen regime, it's the only thing that's brought any kind of hope or any kind of reconstruction or any kind of protection from the Khmer Rouge to the Cambodian people. And that has to be the principal and the sole concern in Cambodia.
Thank you. Some of the participants, I understand, have planes to catch. We're going to take two more questions. The people that are microphones right now, this microphone here.
I'm Roz Windsor, and I'm with the newly formed Campaign to Free Cambodia from the Khmer Rouge. I wanted to ask Mr. Lambertson and actually other panelists to respond to David Hawk's question about why the United States does not bring action to bring the forces of Pol Pot before the Genocide Convention.
Thank you. Secretary Lambertson.
This is always a difficult question for me, not because I have difficulty with the concept, but because I'm not a lawyer, and when I am asked this question and variants of it by Chet Atkins in Congressman Solarz's hearings, I always like to have a lawyer to whom I can turn and ask him to answer the question. My reticence has to do not with any disagreement with respect to the moral dimensions of the problem that exists in Cambodia or the nature of the Khmer Rouge crimes, but because I've never been able to pursue very, very clearly my way through the legal thickets that are involved here. I think that Pol Pot should be brought to justice. I think that that he, under any circumstances, must be allowed no future political role in Cambodia. His associates should be brought to justice for the abhorrent crimes that they committed. Frankly, my own personal focus and my own personal priority has been on the effort to achieve some sort of negotiated settlement to this conflict, which I think is the first priority, an end to the fighting. And I think that as part of that, and at the very least as a priority objective for a government that emerges from a transition process and an election, that meting out justice to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge responsible for the crimes that they committed is very, very important. I hope it happens. I'm sorry that I can't describe to you the manner in which I think it should happen.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Congressman Atkins, you have a comment?
Yeah, I would just say that I've asked the administration this question and have the response from their lawyers. The response is that the U.S. position, and David outlined very clearly the process by which, under the Genocide Treaty, that you would bring someone to justice. Response of the lawyers is that, first of all, there were reservations attached to the Genocide Treaty which would make it difficult for us to bring Pol Pot to justice. I've examined that in conjunction with a number of other people. There isn't a single legal mind who does work in these areas that I'm aware of who believes that any of those Senate reservations attached by Strom Thurmond had, and by Jesse Helms, had in any way preclude the United States from using Article 9 to bring Pol Pot and his top leadership to justice. Second thing is that the administration maintains that we should not proceed to bring Pol Pot to justice for an international tribunal, but rather we should support the efforts of the Cambodian people after a comprehensive settlement to do that, in light of the fact that the administration's view of a comprehensive settlement includes the Khmer Rouge. You're asking the Khmer Rouge to bring themselves to justice, and this is part of what just absolutely boggles my mind. I mean, I'm sorry, maybe I just don't get it, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think that a fundamental principle, and I think Steve Solar's suggestion is a very productive one, of some kind of UN process. But I think in the meantime, while you're trying to deal with that diplomatically, and it is going to be very, very difficult to do, doing things, and my problem with U.S. policy is we're not doing the things right now to break the back of Khmer Rouge power, that we're still engaged in our policy in this fantasy that if we can use the Khmer Rouge military might to bring people to the bargaining table. And the fact of the matter is that if we were to start in an international tribunal to bring Pol Pot to trial, that would put Steve's proposal for a UN receivership in a substantially different light. The thing that the Cambodian people want to know and want some kind of assurance is that the U.S. isn't going to unleash Pol Pot again, or provide them with some protection if it appears that Pol Pot will be unleashed in the Cambodian countryside.
Last question.
I'm going to pass the mic.
Please.
Just like to comment that those who advocate a political sharing seem to underestimate the intelligence of the Khmer Rouge, who aren't just going to walk into giving away their power for a ballot.
Question.
This is just a suggestion. My name is Arn, and I'm working for David Hawk, and I would like to ask if the United States can help me. I myself was forced by the Khmer Rouge to carry guns and fight when I was 12 years old, and I've been back to the camp, and I met some of you there, and I just would like to ask you if you can help me. The United States can help me to get those kids out of there, of the Khmer Rouge camp, like inside A, inside B, and also many civilians there, like 85% of civilians and the kids there that were forced right now by the Khmer Rouge to go and fight again. And if there's the United States can help me out, and against their will, that they would go by the force of the Khmer Rouge, could they be moved to some place like out to Kavidang or somewhere non-communist? Can you help? I think the United States can help me out of this.
Thank you for your comment. On behalf of the Kennedy School of Government, We'd once again like to thank this distinguished panel of guests that joined us for this wide-ranging debate on American policy towards Cambodia. Thank you very much.